Welcome to round 5 of the World Chess Championship. We've had 4 rounds so far where 2 games were decisive and the score is currently 2-2. So, what have the players cooked up for today's game as the players had a rest day? Let's take a look. So this time, Jan is with the white pieces, Ding Liren is with the black pieces. Let's take a look. E4 was the first move, E5, Knight of 3, Knight C6, and Bishop B5. Once again, the relapse, just like game 1. A6 was played, Bishop A4, Knight of 6, short castle, Bishop E7. In the first game, white played here, Bishop takes C6, which was the delayed exchange of the bishop here, which is very uncommon. Usually the bishop captures the knight right away. Whereas in the first game, the bishop went back and then captured on c6. But here, Jan went for a different move and played the move d3, which is much more common to play here because you're simply defending the pawn on e4 and you're preparing to develop all your other pieces. So b5 was played, bishop b3, and here d6. Now, of course, knight a5 is a threat because this bishop is usually a monster in the relapse. So because of this, white plays move c3, so that after a move like knight a5, the bishop will slide back to c2. Short castle was played, h3, which can be pretty useful as you don't allow bishop g4 to happen. And of course, creating luft for your king is always very useful. Bishop b7 was played, a4 is played here, attacking the pawn, b5. Now, of course, it is defended, so it doesn't make so much of a difference. But this is very common to play in those type of positions in this pawn structure. Knight a5, bishop goes back to a2 instead, because, well, now you're able to go to a2. And this bishop is much stronger on this diagonal, of course. It is stopping any sort of f5 from happening anytime soon, because if black gets to move f5, then, of course, they will have a much better position. So, yeah, usually the bishop goes back to c2, but that is because a move like a4 hasn't been played, and now the bishop is safe on a2. c5 is now played, bishop g5, simply developing pieces after h6. Now, white has the option to either retreat to h4 or go back to e3, for example, or to take on f6. Now, of course, going back to h4 is more of the common approach, logically speaking, because he went to g5 for a reason, to stay on this diagonal. But because there is a bishop on d7, there's no actual pin over here. And the reality is that after bishop h4, there's g5. The bishop has to go back to g3. And look how bad this bishop is on g3. It is staring at those 2 pawns over here, those that are really well protected. And for that reason, this bishop is just horrendous. And it is very common practice that you just don't play bishop h4 unless you have a very good reason. But here it is clear that there's no good reason, and that's why with the move bishop g5, Jan had it already in mind to take on f6, which he did, basically giving up the bishop pair, but with good reasons because the position is more or less closed. So let's see what happens in the next few moves. A takes b5, a takes b5, knight bd2, knight c6. And yeah, I mean, the knight has to go back at some point. The knight is not doing anything on a5. Anyways, it is very common in the relapse that black maneuvers the pieces around to see where the pieces can be placed better. So bishop d5 is now played, rook takes a1, queen takes a1, queen d7. Very logical common moves. Rook e1. This is very common to play in the relapse as well, as a knight prefers to be placed on either e3 or g3 to potentially go to f5. Rook a8, and now the queen has to go back to d1. Bishop d8, black is maneuvering the bishop to another place and also potentially preparing a move like f5, of course. Right now it's not possible because there's a bishop on d5, but let's see what black has in mind for the next few moves. Knight f1 has been played, knight e7, attacking that bishop on d5. Now, of course, white is going to trade that because black had the pair of bishops, and now without one of those bishops, it will be much harder to see where black's play is, right? Of course, there's still a lot possible, but the power of the bishop pair is the fact that there's 2 bishops alive. And if there's only one alive, then your advantage of the bishops is not so strong anymore. Knight e3 was played, bishop b6, h4, white is expanding on the king side, queen c6, h5, there goes Harry, c4, Black is, of course, trying to expand on the queen side instead and try to attack as well. d4 is now played. White is, of course, not really willing to capture this pawn because after d takes c4, b takes c4 is possible. And those pawns on the queen side of white are not so great. This pawn is a backwards pawn and can be an easy target for black. So that's why d4 is simply striking in the center. E takes d4, knight takes d4. It was in this position that Ding made a slight mistake. He played the move queen c5, and it makes sense because the queen will be able to go towards the king side, and it seems like the queen is more active on c5. However, the problem with the move queen c5 is that you have no option of taking on d4 right in time when you have to, because the problem, as you can see probably already here, is that those knights in the center are very strong. They are controlling those really strong squares, d5 and f5, and for that reason it is really hard to face those knights. And imagine one pair of knights will be traded off. This knight is significantly stronger than this bishop. It has so much more potential in this very position. So for that reason, black needs to be prepared to capture the knight off on d4 or on e3 so that we will have a more balanced position and black will have an easier time trying to equalize this game, because of course white is the one here trying to push and fight for the advantage. And for that reason, the move queen c5 was a bit premature, and a move like queen c7 or queen d7 would have been much better to keep the option of trading off one of the knights. Queen c5 was played instead, and here comes queen g4, preparing the attack on the king side. Queen e5, very solid move. Knight f3, attacking the queen. Now the queen has to move again. Queen e6, offering the trade of queens, but of course white is not going to capture that queen because, well, white is just getting started with the king side attack. Knight f5 was played, knight takes f5, e takes f5, queen f6. And here you can already see that white just has a really nice position because of the fact that this knight has so much more potential than this bishop. It seems like this bishop is significantly stronger because it has access to so many squares. The position is more or less open, and we know that in open positions, bishops are significantly better than knights. But if you see how much potential this knight has, it can maneuver around to e4. It can help somehow with the attack on the king side. Maybe we'll see g4, g5 being played, and then the knight becomes even more useful. So in the long run, this knight is so much better than this bishop. And it will be really difficult for black to really maneuver the pieces in such a way to really try to hold on and, continue playing the game, survive. So queen e4 was played, attacking the rook on a8, rook b8. And here Jan played the move rook e2, which is a really insane move because it seems like Jan is not really making progress with this move and it's just a random move played. However, white has something in mind here. White is seeing that black's plan is to play the move b4. And after b4, c takes b4, the pawn on b2 would be under attack. So Jan is basically defending this pawn with the rook over here and making it impossible for black to play b4 because now b4 looks pretty silly. So now black goes for bishop c5, and here comes white with the move g4. White is simply saying, I'm weakening my king on g1, but black is simply unable to touch the king on g1. Black goes back to d8 because it's really hard to see what other move black has. Queen d5, centralizing the queen even more. King f8, and this is what happens when you just don't have any moves. Black doesn't have any moves, and Ding is simply going into passive mode, asking a white the question, can you attack me? And maybe if white starts attacking, black can find a way to untangle from this position and strike back. King f1, white is also taking the same approach, but with a bit more thought in mind. The idea behind King f1 is that you're simply stepping out of any sort of checks along the g file. Imagine somewhere g5 happens and then the queen can suddenly come to g5. Stuff like that. So king f1, a very prophylactical move. Rook c8, rook e4. Again, such a crazy move because now the move b4 will just never happen because c4 is under attack twice. And that's pretty disastrous. Rook b8, g5. Now is the time that white is going for that move. White is all ready and set to push g5. After h takes g5, rook g4. That was the idea behind the move rook e4, to jump with the rook towards g4 and attack that pawn on g5 and slowly but surely demolish black's king side. Rook a8, knight takes g5, rook a1 check, king e2. I mean, it's crazy that the king is in the middle of the board, but there's barely checks for black here. Queen e7 check, and now knight e4, and the king is safe. It's crazy. Queen e8, king f3. The king is just playing king of the hill over here. Queen e8, trying to trade off those queens, and white is more than happy to go for this simply because f6 is just a disaster for black. If black takes on f6, there's knight takes f6, and it will be really difficult for black to stop this pawn, because after king e7, to give space to the rook on the 8th rank, knight g8 check would be played, and this pawn is unstoppable. So after f6, that's why Ding went for g6, h takes g6, f takes g6, rook takes. This pawn on f6 is just crushing it. Rook a2, king g4, rook takes b2, and rook h6. And this was the moment that Ding resigned, because this pawn is simply unstoppable on f6. The king will slide towards e6, and this bishop can just not do anything. It is pretty much useless over here, and the rook has no squares to access any of white's pieces pretty much. So for that reason, Ding resigned and Jan won in a very convincing fashion. It was really difficult to see where things really went wrong. One move that we can point out is the move queen c5 that we saw that was a slight inaccuracy, and it basically caused black's position to collapse. After that, it was really difficult to come back, and that's why sometimes bishops are not that good in open positions. We saw that the knight has so much more mobility, causing a lot of problems for black. With this win, Jan is leading the match with 1 point, and those ones are very important.